The desert didn't forget anything. It held the footprints of those who fled, the blood of those who fought, and the silence of those no longer there to speak. And on the edge of that vast, sun-bleached world stood Clayton Ward, a rancher who asked for little more than quiet days, sound cattle, and coffee that didn't taste like grit. He didn't go looking for trouble. But trouble had a way of finding the kind of man who didn't look away. It was just past sundown when he saw them, tracks, fresh ones, cutting through the dust near the south ridge of his land. Smaller prints, one set much lighter than the other, not boot prints. Barefoot, one adult, one child. They were running. He followed them without thinking, the sun a red bruise on the horizon, rifle slung low, boots heavy on the dry earth. He didn't know why, only that something in him stirred. He found them near a thicket of mesquite. A woman, collapsed at the roots, arms wrapped around a boy who couldn't have been more than 6. Her long dark hair was tangled with burrs, her skin bruised, her clothes torn, and her eyes, when they opened, were fierce and terrified all at once. She didn't speak, just clutched the child tighter and stared at him as if she expected the next thing to be a bullet. Clayton raised both hands slowly. "Ain't here to hurt you," he said. "You're on my land. You need water. I've got some." Still, she didn't move. The boy stirred, murmured something in Apache. Clayton didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Fear, exhaustion, hope. Minutes later, he handed her a canteen. She took it, hesitant, then drank like she hadn't seen water in days. She gave some to the boy who leaned into her like a shadow. Clayton crouched down, not close, but close enough to speak softly. "You got a name?" She hesitated, then said, "Nayeli." "And the boy?" "Tyan, my son." He nodded once. "Someone's chasing you?" Her gaze flickered over her shoulder toward the open desert. "Yes." "How many?" She looked him in the eye. "Enough to kill us both." Clayton stood slowly, eyes narrowing toward the horizon. He didn't know her, didn't owe her. But when she looked back at him, sunburned and shaking, but still standing between her boy and the world, he felt something old in his chest spark to life. "Resolve. Come on," he said. "I've got a barn with a door that locks and a shotgun that still bites." Nayeli didn't thank him, but she stood, and for a woman who'd been marked for death, that was thanks enough. Clayton led them back slow, careful not to push. Nayeli walked with a limp, one hand around her son's shoulder, the other gripping the canteen. Tyen kept glancing over his shoulder like the desert might suddenly reach up and swallow them whole. Clayton said nothing. He knew what it meant to be hunted, not by name, but by intent. By the time they reached the ranch, the sky had bled into navy. Coyotes howled in the far distance, and stars flickered above like they didn't care who lived or died below. He guided them to the barn first. "You'll be safe here tonight," he said, unbolting the heavy door. Inside it smelled of hay and sweat and old timber. He handed Nayeli a clean blanket and nodded to a pile of stacked straw. "Ain't a feather bed, but it's dry and warmer than the dirt." She didn't respond. She simply looked around, as if checking every shadow for a blade. Tyen was already asleep before she laid him down. Clayton brought bread, jerky, and warm water in a dented tin cup. When Nayeli finally sat, her body trembled. Not from cold, but from the tension that never let go. He crouched nearby, hands resting loosely on his knees. "Someone did this to you." She looked up sharply. He didn't press, just waited. Finally, she nodded. "Settlers, not far. They think I saw something." "Did you?" She looked him square in the eyes. "Yes." Clayton exhaled slowly. Truth was a dangerous thing out here. He stood. "You'll stay here as long as you need. I don't run from men who kill women and children." She watched him, brow furrowed. "Why are you helping us?" Clayton glanced at the boy, then answered simply, "Because someone should have helped my wife." The words left a silence so deep, even the barn seemed to lean in. That night, Clayton sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the desert beyond the fence line. Inside the barn, he heard Nayeli whispering in Apache to her son, soft words like wind through pine needles. He didn't understand them, but he understood the way her voice trembled with strength, and how it reached across the dark like a promise. You are not alone anymore. By sunrise, the desert was already warming. Claire didn't knock. She never did. The neighbor from 2 miles east had always come with coffee, gossip, and the kind of questions wrapped in sugar but served cold. But this time she brought something else. "You hear what happened to the Bastro camp?" she asked. eyes narrowing. Clayton tensed, setting his mug down slowly on the porch rail. No, what? Someone burned it. Last night. Whole place gone. Sheriff says the Apache woman they were holding escaped. Clayton felt the weight of every word. Claire's eyes narrowed as she studied him. Funny thing, tracks went west, toward your land. He met her gaze evenly. Desert has a lot of directions, Claire. She huffed. Just be careful who you feed. Some things come back hungry. Then she left, and the porch was quiet again. Clayton didn't go back inside right away. He just stood there, staring out at the dust and sage. He knew one thing now for certain. They were coming, and they weren't going to ask questions. In the barn, Nayeli stood holding her son's hand, watching the light shift through the slats. Her eyes met Clayton's as he entered. They know? He nodded. They're talking, not moving yet, but they will. She straightened. Then we'll go. No. His voice stopped her cold. He stepped closer, quiet but firm. If you run again, you'll bleed out in the sand. You're not strong enough yet. The boy needs food, water, safety. Her jaw tightened. We don't have that. You do now. She stared at him, uncertain. Not because she didn't believe him, but because she hadn't known what belief in someone else felt like for a long time. They'll burn your ranch, she said. Clayton looked around at the land he'd built with his hands. The corral, the fence line, the old barn he and his wife had painted long ago. Then he looked at her. Let him try. That afternoon, he moved her and Tyann into the old storage shed. Stone walls, only one entrance, a solid bolt. It had been a root cellar once. Now it would be a stronghold. He boarded the barn windows, loaded shells, drove stakes into the ground like he meant to keep something rooted. And when the sun dipped again, he sat on his porch, rifle across his lap, just like the night before. Only this time, he wasn't guarding just a barn. He was guarding hope, and hope, once it finds a place to live, isn't easily taken back. The attack didn't come at night like he expected. It came midday, when the sun was high and the world pretended to be calm. Clayton heard them before he saw them. Hooves pounding like thunder across dry ground, the wind carrying shouts laced with drunken confidence. 4 riders, too few for a war but enough for a warning. He didn't step inside, didn't hide. He stood on the front porch with his rifle held low and his eyes locked on the trail. The lead man rode with a crooked posture and a revolver hanging lazily from his side. He spat before speaking. Mighty warm day to be harboring trouble, Ward. Clayton didn't blink. Only trouble I see is riding toward me with whiskey on its breath. One of the others laughed. Another circled wide, eyeing the barn and the fencing. The leader tilted his head. Heard you've got an Apache squaw hiding somewhere out here. That true? Clayton's grip on the rifle didn't shift. I don't answer to men who burn camps and chase children through the desert. The leader's smile faded. His hand twitched toward his gun. Last warning, rancher. Hand her over and we walk. Clayton stepped forward, calm and clear. You take one more step toward my land and you won't walk anywhere ever again. Silence stretched like a wire. Then, after a long moment, the leader sneered and spat again. This ain't over. No, Clayton said. It's just begun. The men turned their horses and rode off in a cloud of dust, their threats echoing behind them. Inside the shed, Nayeli had been listening. She held Tyann close, his tiny body curled into her lap, heart racing as fast as hers. When Clayton entered, she stood. They'll be back, she said. I know. With more. Clayton nodded. Then I'll dig more graves. She stared at him. At the lines on his face. At the man who had given up his safety, his land, and possibly his life. For her and her child. You'll die for us? Clayton didn't hesitate. No. He looked at Tyann, then back at her. I'll live for you, but I won't let anyone take that choice from me. Something in her cracked then. Not her fear, but the shell around it. The wall she had built since the day they took everything from her. She stepped forward and pressed her hand to his. And for the first time, she whispered, My name. It means I am the one who walks beyond fire. Clayton met her eyes. Then you're not walking alone anymore. Clayton spent the night reinforcing the ranch. He set traps in the brush, hid a second rifle beneath the porch, carved new stakes and sharpened them by lantern light. Not out of panic, but preparation. This wasn't a battle he wanted, but if one came, he'd meet it on his feet. Nayeli stood at the edge of the field the next morning, wrapped in a wool blanket, watching the land stretch wide and quiet. Tyann was still asleep, curled beneath a quilt Claire had sewn years ago. The air was still, too still, She heard Clayton walk up behind her. "I can leave," she said quietly. "Tonight. Take the boy. Go east. They won't follow far if we're fast." Clayton shook his head. "That's what they want. You running. They'll burn this place." He looked at the fence line, then the sky. "It's only wood. I can rebuild wood." She turned to him, voice barely above breath. "And what if they kill you?" Clayton met her gaze, unwavering. "Then I'll die standing for something that matters." Nayeli said nothing, but when she walked back toward the shed, she didn't close the door all the way. She left it open. Around noon, a rider came alone. A boy, barely grown, bearing a scrap of paper with jagged handwriting. Clayton read it once, then again. "Bring the woman by sundown, or we take her ourselves." He crumpled the note slowly, then tossed it into the fire. Nayeli watched from the corner. "What did it say?" Clayton looked at her. "It said they're afraid." She raised an eyebrow. "That's not what it meant." "No," he said, "but it's what it tells me." She walked to him slowly. "They won't stop." He didn't flinch. "Neither will I." That night, after Tyan was asleep again, Clayton sat with Nayeli beneath the stars, the fire between them low and steady. She reached for something inside the blanket and unfolded a bundle of beads, red, black, and sky blue. She handed it to him. "These were my husband's," she said. "He died protecting our people. I never thought I'd give them to another man." Clayton didn't take them. He looked at her first. "You sure?" She nodded once. He reached out and took them, gently, then placed them over his wrist and tied them in silence. A warrior's gift, a survivor's vow, and a moment where neither race, nor history, nor the weight of old blood meant anything more than this. "I trust you." The sun dropped like a knife behind the ridge. Its last light painted the valley in amber and shadow. Clayton stood at the edge of his porch, rifle across his chest, the beads Nayeli had given him wrapped tight around his wrist. Every sound in the distance felt sharper, closer, too quiet. Behind him, in the cellar, Nayeli sat beside her son, one hand stroking his hair, the other gripping a blade she had carried since before Tyan was born. She hadn't asked Clayton to fight for her, but he had, and that meant she wouldn't let him stand alone. Just before dark, movement stirred in the east. 6 riders, no torches, no voices, just silhouettes and dust rising under their horses' hooves. Clayton watched without blinking, his boots planted firm, his heart steady. The lead rider called out. "You had your chance, Ward." Clayton called back. "You have yours now. Turn around. No blood needs spilling." The man laughed, low and cold. "That woman's cursed. She saw what she wasn't meant to. She brings danger." "She brings a child," Clayton said. A pause. "He ain't one of us." Clayton didn't hesitate. "He's one of mine now." The silence that followed felt like the space between thunder and lightning. Then they rode. Fast, direct, loud. Clayton raised the rifle, not to kill, but to protect. He fired once into the air, then again at the ground near the led horse's feet. The dust exploded. The horse screamed and reared, nearly throwing its rider, but the others didn't stop. Clayton took a third shot. This one clipped the edge of a saddle, sending the man tumbling. Still, 2 pressed on, and that's when the shed door burst open. Nayeli stepped out with fire in her eyes and an old Comanche bow in her hands. She pulled it back fast and clean, loosing an arrow that tore through the sleeve of one attacker. They reeled, pulled reins, one cursed, and then, finally, they turned, retreating, fast, back into the dark where they belonged. Clayton lowered his rifle, heart hammering. Nayeli stood still, bow lowered but ready. For a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling dry grass. Then Clayton looked at her. "You kept that quiet." She almost smiled. "You never asked." He stepped closer, eyes scanning her face, seeing her not as someone he had rescued, but as someone who had stood beside him when it counted. "I'm glad you stayed." "I almost didn't," she said. Then she looked past him, toward the boy who now ran toward them barefoot, awake from the noise, arms outstretched. She caught Tyan mid-run, held him close, and for the first time whispered, "We're still here." Clayton rested a hand on her shoulder. "And we're not going anywhere." By morning, the dust had settled. No more riders came. No more threats whispered on the wind. The quiet that followed wasn't tense. It was something else. Something rare. Earned. Clayton patrolled the outer fence line at dawn. The sun lit the earth gold. A hawk circled above. He could still feel the rhythm of last night in his bones, but his hands were steady. His heart, too. When he returned to the house, He found Nayeli sitting on the porch steps, Tyen curled up asleep in her lap. Her hair was loose for the first time since he'd met her, and she was humming. Not loudly, not for him, just for the moment. He sat beside her without a word. Later that day, they rode out to check the north pasture together. Nayeli had insisted. She said she couldn't stand sitting anymore, that her blood needed motion. Clayton handed her a small rifle. Just in case, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Still don't trust me? He smiled faintly. No, I just don't like being the only one with a good shot. She mounted the horse like someone who'd done it 1,000 times, and maybe she had. She didn't tell him much about her life before, and he didn't ask, because the woman riding beside him now wasn't someone from a tragic past. She was someone choosing to live again. That evening, they sat by the fire with Tyen asleep once more, curled up between them. Claire from the next ranch over had stopped by earlier, this time with less suspicion and more stew. Town's talking, she had said. Some say you ran off raiders. Others say she's a witch. Clayton had only grunted. Let them say it. Either way, they'll leave us alone. Nayeli had laughed after she left. A witch? I've seen you fight. Seems fair. Now in the firelight, Nayeli turned to him. You've given us something I thought we'd never have again. He looked at her, voice quiet. What's that? She touched the beads, still tied around his wrist. A place to stay, without fear. Clayton nodded. You gave it back to me too. She tilted her head. Did you lose it? He stared into the fire. When I buried my wife, I didn't think I'd ever build something again. But now, he looked at her, then at the boy sleeping between them. Now maybe it's not about building alone. That night, Nayeli didn't return to the shed. She stayed in the house, not because she was afraid, but because she wasn't anymore. And when she rested beside Clayton, her hand near his, her child safe between them, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. Silence had finally become a language of peace. Days passed, then a week, then 2. The threat faded into memory, but Clayton didn't let his guard down. Not entirely. He still walked the fence each morning, still checked the shed's bolt, still watched the horizon like a man who had learned that peace was not something given. It was something protected. But inside the ranch house, things were different. There was laughter again. Tyen ran through the rooms barefoot, chasing dust motes and pretending to hunt coyotes. Nayeli kept the fire warm and her voice low, humming songs in Apache while grinding herbs she'd foraged from the creek. And Clayton? He found himself smiling more than he expected. One evening, he came in late from the stables, boots muddy, shirt damp from fixing a broken trough. As he stepped inside, the smell of roasted beans and flatbread greeted him. Nayeli turned from the hearth with a half smirk. You work too long. You cook too well. She handed him a tin plate and sat across from him at the small wooden table. For a while they just ate, peacefully, as if they had always shared meals. Then softly she said, Tyen asked if we live here now. Clayton looked up, his jaw tightening. And what did you tell him? She folded her hands. I said we don't live somewhere. She glanced at him. We live with someone. Clayton blinked, setting his fork down. You don't have to keep saying thank you. I'm not. She leaned forward, voice steady. I'm telling you we're not leaving unless you ask us to. There was no hesitation in his voice. I won't. And just like that, the line between guest and home disappeared. That night, Tyen fell asleep in the crook of Clayton's arm as Nayeli watched from across the room, arms folded, smiling faintly. Clayton looked down at the boy, safe, soft breathing, small fingers gripping the edge of his worn shirt. He looked up at her. You trust me with him? Nayeli walked over, sat beside them both. I trust you with everything. And in that moment, beneath the roof he built with his hands, and the warmth he didn't know he'd feel again, Clayton understood. He hadn't just saved a life. He'd been invited into one. The first snow came early that year, just a dusting, barely enough to cover the roof, but enough to remind them that seasons changed, whether you were ready or not. Clayton sat by the fire sharpening his old knife. Tyen lay on a bearskin rug nearby, carving a small horse from pine with clumsy hands and fierce concentration. Nayeli sat on the floor beside him, mending one of Clayton's shirts by firelight. It was quiet, but not empty. It was the kind of quiet that filled you, not drained you. After supper, they walked together to the north fence, where the land dipped and the wind carried pine through the canyon. Clayton had placed a wooden post there years ago, meant to mark the boundary of the property, but tonight he carried something else in his hand. a cedar plank, freshly sanded. He handed Nayeli the carving knife. I figured if we're going to stay, we ought to put it in writing. She smiled softly, understanding. Together they etched 3 names: Clayton, Nayeli, Tyen. She paused before finishing, then added one more line beneath them. Found in fire, kept in peace. Clayton read it twice, then reached out and touched her hand. You still think you were marked for death? He asked gently. Nayeli looked out at the land around her, at the boy chasing rabbits along the creek bed, at the home that no longer felt borrowed. I think they tried. She turned to him, but someone else marked me for something stronger. What's that? A second life. He nodded. And maybe a second love? Her smile deepened. Not a second, she whispered. A true one. They stood there for a long time beneath the stars, wind brushing through their coats, the scent of cedar and cold earth rising up around them. And when they returned to the house, the door creaked open not to let them in, but to welcome them home. The winter came down harder in the months that followed. Snow piled deep along the ridge. The wind howled through the canyons like wolves at night. But the cabins stayed warm, because they stayed warm together. Clayton, once a man who ate alone and slept in silence, now rose each morning to the sound of Tyen's footsteps and the scent of something hot from Nayeli's hands. His rifle still hung by the door, but he hadn't had to lift it since that night the riders turned back, because when word spread that the Apache woman was protected, no one dared test it again. Not because they feared Clayton, but because they feared what a man does when he's finally found something worth protecting. One morning in early spring, Clayton saddled his horse while Tyen sat nearby, carving a new bird out of driftwood. Nayeli brought him coffee and leaned against the barn door. You planning to ride alone today? She asked. Just to the canyon and back. She nodded. You still check the old trail? Old habits. She looked out over the hills. Do you think they'll ever come again? Clayton mounted the horse and answered honestly. Maybe. Then he looked down at her, his voice softer. But if they do, we won't be running. Not now, not ever. That evening, they walked to the edge of the property, where the post still stood with their names carved deep. Snow had melted around it, and the earth smelled of green things waiting to rise. Tyen reached up and ran his fingers across his name. Does this mean we belong here now? Clayton crouched beside him. This means you always did. He looked at Nayeli, who had tears in her eyes but didn't wipe them away, and he added, You both did. That night, by firelight, Clayton wrapped his arms around them both. Nayeli leaned her head on his shoulder. Tyen curled against his side like it was the safest place on earth. And it was, because in the end, it hadn't been the gunfire that saved them. It hadn't been the barn or the bolt or the rifle. It had been the choice, to see a woman marked for death, and mark her instead for love, for life, for a place that would never turn her away again.